So welcome again to everyone, part of the Liberal Judaism family that has come together just a few weeks after our biennial to celebrate Shavuot together. We did not imagine, just like with Pesach, that we would be celebrating Shavuot in this remote, virtual, but close way, as we are again tonight. But tonight really offers a different opportunity for us. We decided on the title, Standing Again at Sinai, Back to the Future, because truly, every year we stand again at Sinai. But we were incredibly aware that this title belongs to Professor Judith Plaskow's book, Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, which is 31 years this year, and was the most groundbreaking, transformative book for us in the Jewish community, particularly the feminist community. Judith is considered to be the first feminist Jewish theologian. But I have read much this week that has said truly this book is considered one of the most significant books that came out in the Jewish community in the 20th century, which is high praise. Before I let you know and introduce you to Professor Judith Plaskow, who agreed to our audacious invitation to join us for a conversation about Standing Again at Sinai and what it means now to be in the Jewish community in terms of scholarship, community, learning Torah, God, I am going to ask Judith straight away a question about Standing Again at Sinai. The idea of revisiting Sinai, as we know, continues to be powerful every generation as we recall the Ten Commandments standing at Sinai. But this book, your book, Judith, remains important for many. What place do you think it holds now, 31 years later? How has it affected Jewish progressive life, inclusion, and scholarship? And perhaps what would be different if you wrote it now?
Makes me feel old when I realize it's 31 years. I feel deeply grateful for the impact that it's had. I think it's helped to galvanize the creation of a lot of commentaries and midrash, and it's made clear what's at stake in the recovery of women's history. I was at the Half-Empty Bookcase Conference in London in 1992, which was a wonderful event. And that's such a powerful image that the bookcase of Jewish books is a bookcase filled with books by men. I've returned to that image lots of times, but there are lots of new books in the bookcase now. And that certainly isn't all due to me. I don't mean to say that, but there are a lot of people who've said to me over the years, I read your book and I realized I needed to start writing midrash or poetry, or I needed to investigate this and that. So I think it has had an impact. Now, the question of what would be different now is very interesting, because I think part of the power of Standing Again at Sinai is that it was in some sense an outsider's book. I have a doctorate in Protestant theology. I was immersed in an academic world of Christian and post-Christian women asking critical questions of their traditions. And I was trying to bring those questions to Judaism at what seemed like a moment of tremendous possibility for the transformation of tradition. And this historical moment is so different. So much has changed, so much is taken for granted. I really can't imagine what it would mean to write the book now. I still completely agree with my Torah chapter that women's history is shrouded in silence, that to include women's voices means the transformation of tradition. There are a lot of things I would change. I assume the gender binary in the book in a way that we've come to question. Maybe we'll talk about that more later. But I do think the book remains an important intervention that's eye-opening for people who read it for the first time.
It certainly is. And I think of what you wrote about Exodus chapter 19 of Moses and God speaking to the men, do not go near a woman, which was about sex, but nonetheless was addressed to women, to men only. And the inference that you, even though all of us have taken it, you gave it credence to see that half of that population wasn't being addressed at that moment. To me, that was critical in the book. But I really want to introduce you to everyone here, because there are many of us who are highly honored that you are here. And I just want to remind everyone of the prestige for us and privilege of having Professor Judith Plaskow with us now. Professor Judith Plaskow is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Manhattan College now, and as we know, considered one of the greatest Jewish feminist theologians, writing into her fourth decade of theology. I'm just going to share some of the groundbreaking roles that Judith has held and that I think have impacted us as Jews around the world. Judith was co-chair of the fledgling Women and Religion group of the American Academy of Religion. She was a co-founder of the pioneering Jewish feminist group Banot Esh, that she might speak a little bit about later, co-founder of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, and served 2 terms of the American Academy of Religion, both as president, vice president, president-elect, and brought a great deal, I think, to that for the whole community of scholarship of Judaism, of religion. Judith is author and editor of several important works in feminist theology. I'm looking at my own copies here, dog-eared, Sex, Sin, and Grace, which Judith wrote at the end of the 1970s, Weaving the Visions, with her longtime partner, Carol Christ, that she has written a great deal of work with, and we'll say more about that in terms of intellectual and academic collaboration. Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, The Coming of Lilith, Essays of Feminism, Judaism and Sexual Ethics, and Goddess and God in the World, Conversations in Embodied Theology, which is your most recent publication in 2016. And I hope we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that captures for you in from the past few years that has impacted your theology. Judith, welcome again, and thank you so much for giving us this time ahead of Shavuot, allowing us to think what it means to stand again at Sinai. So I'm just going to intersperse a quick question here from my colleague, Rabbi Yuval Keren, who wanted to ask Judith, are there any feminist stories in the Bible? Would Ruth, that we'll read tomorrow, count as a feminist story? Does Vashti hold a title of being feminist by attacking the patriarchy? What do you think?
Well, I certainly think that Vashti is a clear feminist in the text. I mean, every time I reread that, I think, go Vashti. And actually, one year, my partner and I brought signs to our synagogue that we held up, go Vashti. The book of Ruth is a wonderful, poignant story, but it's about women making their way within a patriarchal society. Is it useful to talk about them as feminists? I don't know. It's such an anachronistic.
Yeah.
I think that there are many moments in the text where we see women using the tools they had available to them in a patriarchal society. I mean, I think of Tamar and Judah, for example. I mean, that you could think of that as a wonderful feminist story, or you see a woman who doesn't have traditional avenues of power, using what tools she has. So I think there are a lot of stories like that.
That's very cheering. So so there are some that need pulling out as opposed to rewriting. So talking of text, the Lilith Midrash, for which you were immensely famous for, was electrifying at the time you wrote it. the audacious story of the idea that Adam having two wives, Lilith and Eve, and the story is still fresh, and I still teach it, and I still love it every time I come up against your words. But you say that your legacy to the Jewish world and to the world of scholarship is about methodology as well as theology. And you have been quoted as saying that it isn't enough to put women in traditionally male roles. Rather, we must reimagine and rebuild the system from the ground up. So I wanted to ask you tonight, do you think women have transformed the rabbinate over these past years since the first Sally ordained on your side of the Atlantic and Jackie here?
Well, I think women have certainly created new rabbinic roles, often as a matter of necessity because they didn't think they fit into the traditional ones. Have women transformed the congregational rabbinate? I don't know. I mean, in some sense, you have to ask women who are in it what they feel about that. But I see a lot of women continuing to struggle with the demands of the rabbinate as a 24/7 job. I don't think that women's presence has changed that about the rabbinate. You know, maybe women have managed to change, you know, medical internships more than they have the rabbinate.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
I see women in the rabbinate struggling with traditional gender expectations. It's certainly been the case that I've been invited to speak in synagogues by women who are rabbis because they don't feel like they can raise feminist issues without being typed. That's all you ever talk about. You know, you hire a woman and she can never talk about anything but women. So I see a lot of women in the rabbinate still struggling with those issues.
Yeah, I think that I think it feels understandable, definitely from my place, and that we're still on a journey, as it were, and history gets made slowly, doesn't it? Yes. So in terms of how texts have changed, I wanted to ask you where you are in your responses to scripture and hermeneutical readings of the scriptures and the texts that you come up against now.
Well, one of my central concerns always has been to get people to confront the difficult texts in the tradition, and that hasn't changed at all. If anything, I've become more and more concerned about that. You know, I think that so often the way that communities deal with difficult texts is to ignore them, and to just talk about something else. I mean, there's so much in the Torah to talk about. You don't have to talk about the difficult texts at any given moment, and yet they're there. We have to deal with them. I mean, in the Lilith Midrash, Lilith and Eve return to the garden, eager to change both Adam and God. Yeah. And that idea that our understanding of God has to change is something that I still would affirm very strongly. So, you know, what do we do when we encounter the violent God in the text, as we did, you know, in this past week's Torah portion? So that's still central to me. How do we grapple with the difficult texts? And I think step one is acknowledging that they're there. Yeah. Acknowledging the pain that they cause us, and then talking as a community about how we move forward from there.
So would you say that with those difficult texts, reading them liturgically as well as studying is important for us to be able to hear them?
Well, it's how do we hear them? You know, reading them liturgically is, are we listening? And how do we read them? Do we read them quickly in an undertone? You know, there are certain texts like the Tokakak text last week that are traditionally read in one breath in an undertone. But what about when we encounter a text where there's violence against women? What about reading that in an undertone? You know, so that the sudden shift calls the congregation's attention to the text and gets people to grapple with it. So on the one hand, I think it's important to hear the text, and on the other hand, we're reading them as the divine word. What does that mean, that we're still lifting up these texts as sacred? So I think there's a real tension there.
Yeah, there definitely is. Yeah, I chose to read the curses last week and hadn't done so for many years, and it was very powerful, and I didn't read them in an under my breath. I read them loud for us to hear and tried to make sense of them in a modern, contemporary, what does that mean? But yes, I like that idea. So the next question I wanted to ask you just takes you slight way from the Jewish world. Here in the UK, faith institutions and leaders have been very important during the pandemic, during COVID. I think our voices have been elevated, but more so congregational leaders. And in the United States, I have learned and watched that over the past two new presidential administrations, there has been a plan, and I think it's a Reform colleague who created it, of 100 letters to be sent by religious scholars for the first 100 days of the administration. It was done for Trump's first 100 days, and it's just completed for Biden and Harris's administration. And I was very charmed to see, I think you were day 10, and I immediately went to look at your letter. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, why are these letters so important? Why is it important to hear from scholars and not just religious leaders, scholars who often don't get access to the world outside the ivory tower of universities? And secondly, what did you ask of President Biden and Vice President Harris?
So let me say, first of all, that when so many people were in shock and mourning after Trump was elected in 2016, Andrea Weiss, who's now the provost at Hebrew Union College, had this idea of bringing together an interfaith group of scholars of religion to write letters to the president and Congress over the first 100 days of the administration. And she wasn't assuming initially that she'd do it again with Biden, but then people said it was so successful, why not do it in this moment of greater hope? So the idea was that each scholar got to choose a particular text that was important to us and to write about the values it represented that we hoped would be manifest in American life. I have to say, I hadn't really thought about the fact that it was scholars and not clergy. I think, first of all, that probably gave the team that put it together a much wider group of interfaith people, because scholars of religion study so many different traditions, and they would be people who knew the text, you know, both from a scholarly and from a religious perspective. Andrea issued the call this time at the point that we were just finishing up Devarim. So Moses' words to Joshua and the community, be strong and resolute, were very to the fore in my mind. So I asked Biden and Congress to be strong and resolute in addressing the pandemic, the social inequalities revealed by the pandemic, and the climate crisis. And I named a number of specific policies I wanted to see enacted. So the idea of the project was that it was nonpartisan, although clearly it was coming from a liberal community. And that it would give people a basis for conversation about fundamental values across religious and political lines. the letters have been very widely publicized and taught in various settings, and I gather they have really provided a basis for discussion. Religion in public life in the US has been so captured by the right that it feels really important to have liberal voices addressing the crucial religious issues of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
These fundamental values.
And if I was to follow up on that, from your stance as a theologian, what are the critical issues that you feel concerned by at the moment?
Well, really, the whole trajectory of my work has been about expanding the circle of participants in the unfolding of Jewish tradition. I mean, in Standing Again at Sinai, I highlight the exclusion of women's voices and insist on our inclusion. Then I spent a couple of decades focusing on GBLT issues, really beginning with gays and lesbians and bisexuals, and then moving into dismantling the gender binary. The issue that's most critical for me now is anti-racism work, both internally in the Jewish community and in the larger US context. How do we acknowledge that Jews are a mixed multitude, as Shavuot says, and that we've always included people of color? How do we address the racism that across our institutions makes Jews of color feel like strangers? And what does it mean to allow the narratives of Jews of color to transform our sense of ourselves as a people? So I'm always looking at expanding the circles of who's on the bookcase, to go back to that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think within the whole liberal Jewish community here, we see ourselves very much as a family. We have many congregations within, and this is absolutely an issue that all of us are grasping. Stephen Bush has just created a commission on the inclusion of, for our board of deputies, of what the Jewish community should look like, a fully inclusive Jewish community, and it is impacting us all. And we were able to hear him speak about that at our biennial conference 2 weeks ago. And I think we are ready to work, not to leave the work to Jews of color, but for every community, every congregation to run with that. And so we echo your enthusiasm for that. So I'm aware that we have a certain amount of time that we get Judith here for our conversation on Shavuot. So I'm going to move on to ask Judith, you're known as the first female Jewish theologian. What does the mantle mean for you?
It was fine with me being the first Jewish feminist theologian. I mean, as I said, I was trained in Protestant theology because at the time that I graduated from college, there was nowhere in the country to study Jewish theology. So, I needed to be the first in order for it to happen, but I wanted to be the first of many. And that's the piece that hasn't happened. I had hoped that feminism was going to reanimate theological conversation in the Jewish community, and that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, so so Judith and I had already talked a little bit. So actually, your hope for where we would be in the wider Jewish community is not as far down the line in terms of theological discourse and how we're moving. Okay, so there's a challenge to many of us to try to pick up, even here across the pond from you. You always talk of collaborative work bringing out the best and most thoughtful thinking. And your publications, all of them bear that out. And as I've said before, Carol Christ has been your longtime collaborator. Who have been the scholars or clergy that have informed your thinking?
Well, there are a lot of people. The scholars who've been most important are my colleagues in the American Academy of Religion. My friend Carol Christ, with whom I've written or edited 3 books. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who's a New Testament scholar, who was really the person who allowed me to see that however patriarchal Judaism might be, women have always been part of Jewish history. Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father and its radical critique of patriarchal religion was huge for me. Katie Cannon and other womanists made me think about issues of difference and intersectionality. Rachel Adler has probably been the most important Jewish feminist influence on my thought, but also Marcia Falk, Lynn Gottlieb, Rebecca Alpert, and many others. And I've been challenged by an amazing new generation or generations, Tamara Cohn, Max Rasfeld, Sarah Lev, Julia Watts-Belser. So, lots, many people.
And do you think the new challenges are, I'm going to just bridge to another question that we discussed. Do you think these new challenges are about, again, expanding the idea of what feminism is and what feminist theology is and who it may now need to include? Something that we established was that when you wrote Sinai, and you've just said it, you wrote about feminist theology overcoming the dualism of patriarchal sexuality. But now, maybe the world has moved on, in particular, the expansion of gender categories. You spoke earlier about non-binary identification. So what are your thoughts about how that has expanded or challenged feminist theology as you created it for us?
Well, there's no question that, much that Standing Again at Sinai assumes that it takes for granted the gender binary. I think that the push beyond the binary radicalizes many of the issues that feminists have raised around dismantling gender roles and expectations. A hugely important contribution of feminist theory was the distinction between sex and gender. Sex being our biologically given identity, and gender, the social characteristics and expectations built around biological identity. And the transgender critique totally upends that distinction, right? Making clear that the male-female binary is also part of gender. It's part of our social construction of gender. It also upends our sexual categories, because to call somebody gay or straight or bisexual assumes the binary. So maybe we actually need to think in terms of the quality of human relationships instead of, what organ goes in what orifice. And I think so. I think that feminism made moving beyond the binary possible.
Right.
And I think moving beyond the binary expands feminism. It can also challenge it in terms of communal resources and attention and, what's the issue of the moment. They can be posed as in conflict, that, feminism is old fashioned, we've done that. And now we're on to dismantling the gender binary, as if those two projects aren't completely interrelated, and dependent on each other. So, and I would say that, insofar as we still live in a male-dominated society, and I assume that's equally true in the UK, I'm not totally ready to give up the category of women.
Yeah.
We need it as a tool for political organizing, because, people who are perceived as women are still marginalized in the society. So, so there are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Would you, just to go back to Exodus chapter 19, that is so shocking when you read it closely and realize that Moses, actually not God, says, do not go near a woman. Mm-hmm. Do you still teach that and talk about women? Do you feel that you need to think more, to expand and pull apart, or you still have those conversations with your students, with your colleagues, where women need to be named?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think women still need to be named, that we still need to look at that passage and other passages like that. And at the same time, raise the question, what does it mean to name this category and use the category as a tool for organizing, and yet hold it more lightly, not see it as an eternal biological truth.
Right. I love that, to hold it lightly. Yes. And you're right that it had to come before anything else came. I think that 1990 is when Standing Again at Sinai came out. And I'm thinking how many young girls have passed through synagogues and have been expected to have their B'not Mitzvah, to participate in B'nai Mitzvah with the same expectations that maybe has shifted over these past 30 years. We are very proud, and I often see boys in my congregation saying, I'm proud of my synagogue because girls and boys do exactly the same. And I'm incredibly proud that it's the boys that say that as much as the girls, that they recognize that that makes for a more just community. And the next stage, and I'm proud to say that we've had our first B'nai Mitzvah, the next stage is for those who aren't identifying but still find their place. And we communities step up to make that space. So perhaps this is a good moment to recall the dedication in Standing Again at Sinai that you dedicated to your son, Alexander, and you quoted from Adrian Rich's of Woman Born, where you wrote, what do we want for our sons? We want them to discover new ways of being men, even as we are discovering new ways of being women. And that always struck me. And when I read it, I always thought if I ever had a son, I would really want to bestow this blessing on him, and was able to do for my oldest son's bar mitzvah. But I wanted to ask what you think you have seen in the difference in our congregations, in our universities of these past 30 years, of how our young people negotiate identity and respect to each other.
Well, I feel like I have whiplash sometimes, that on the one hand, I feel like everything has changed. I mean, our young people are growing up in congregations where boys and girls are given the same education and they do have the same roles. And there's the sense that they can take on leadership. And on the other hand, there are moments where I feel like nothing has changed, that you can have a conference on the future of world Jewry that has 2 women speakers out of 40, or you could see a new book published that has, 1 woman in the table of contents, or a lot of what I mentioned before, that a lot of women who are rabbis are still needing to deal with traditional role expectations, the fact of harassment in the Jewish community and abuse in so many of our institutions speaks to the male-dominated ethos. So I think, so both those things are true at the same time, that the changes that have taken place in the last 30 years, were in some sense unimaginable at the time, and yet there's a way in which the structures of male domination have proved much more tenacious than
resilient.
I fantasized when I wrote The Coming of Lilith and imagined even Lilith turning the world upside down.
No, it's true. It felt a utopian vision in when you wrote it in, I think, the end of the 70s, but it feels very real for us now. Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Rabbi Leil Mulstein, sets us the challenge, and I believe she even records it. How often do we quote women scholars in our sermons? And she said, and she rightly calls us on it, and I think she does it with another colleague, of how easily we fall into referring to Rashi or to Heschel. I mean, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel deserves to be quoted an enormous amount, but there are many female scholars and rabbis that maybe we just don't reach for so easily. And so I'm always very grateful to her challenging us and calling us to that, because that's a continuation of the work. It's not just reading, it is trying to explore that. That said, I do remember my 7-year-old son saying to a male rabbi that I moved congregation and joined, and said, "I had no idea men could be rabbis, mummy." So that was a great moment. But he now well knows that they can be. So we would love to just hear a little bit more about your most recent book, Goddess and God in the World, Conversations in Embodied Theology. And I know that you and Carol Christ, I've been mispronouncing her name, have a different view of that. I read in a review of what embodied theology means for us. And I think for many of us, we would love to understand what that is.
So Carol and I we met as graduate students at Yale more than 50 years ago now. And we've been arguing about theology ever since. We had each, sometime around 2010, we had each decided that we wanted to be writing a book about God. And we thought, well, why not write together and explore our differences. Really, what we talk about in the book is, first of all, the major difference between us is whether to stay within a patriarchal tradition or to leave. I mean, this has always been the central issue at between us, because Carol was Christian at the time we were graduate students, and she left and became a goddess feminist. So we talk about that difference and we push each other on that decision, but we also talk about our very different understandings of the sacred. While neither of us has a traditional understanding of God as the male power outside the world, and we spent a lot of time deconstructing that together. When we began coming to our own views of God, we found that they were very different in a couple of ways. Carol thinks of God as personal, and I don't. And Carol thinks of God as totally good, and I think of God as embracing both good and evil. So what we explore in the book is those crucial differences, really.
Okay.
And we talk about, how one comes to create a theology and how you judge theologies and how you argue theology.
And so that's so interesting to hear that Carol left Christianity, has become a goddess feminist?
Yes, a goddess feminist. Mm-hmm.
Goddess feminist. And how has it impacted you in your in where you choose to pray or to be part of Jewish congregational life? I know that I've mentioned that you were a founder member of B'not Esh, and it might be interesting for us to hear in your words what that collective and group of women are. But how do you choose, what nourishes you if you choose to be in a congregational, liturgical prayer, chavurah space?
Well, it's interesting. I think that my friendship with Carol made me realize that transformation was possible within a tradition, that you didn't need to leave to experiment with new ritual and new storytelling. So it was very freeing, actually, to be in relationship with her and seeing the work that she was doing. B'not Esh is my Jewish Feminist spirituality collective that's actually meeting for the 40th year in a couple of weeks.
Goodness.
We called the first meeting in 1981, bringing together a group of women to try to imagine what a feminist Judaism would look like. And originally, we thought we were going to transform Judaism in a weekend, and turned out we needed a little bit more time. So, but what we have done really over the last 40 years, I mean, we've done many things, but one of the questions that we've raised over and over again is, what is feminist Torah? What does feminist Torah look like? Mm-hmm. And so I've had a space to, create new ritual, to tell new stories, to ask, what does it mean to read new stories? That's been very nourishing. Mm-hmm. I've also been part of various Chavarot, and then for the last decade, a congregation that's, a congregation of and Chavarot with both men and women, and that project of asking, how do we connect to tradition in a way that's transformative, really brings us back to what we were talking about grappling with the difficult places in the text. How do we
stay within it? You stay within it, holding tight to it, but grapple with it.
Yeah, and how do we do that in a way that moves us forward?
It's encouraging for us. Thank you, Judith. Judith, I have found myself during the age of Zoom always being rather intrigued by what people have behind them, whether it captures what is important to them, whether it be books, whether it be flowers, whether it be pictures or memories or photos. And I just wonder whether you might want to share anything that's behind you, on the wall behind you. It looks like you're in your office, and it might be things of note and interest for us.
Well, actually, most of the things here are pictures from my granddaughter.
Fantastic. Okay.
Over the last several years. So, I think that's probably the most notable.
Yeah.
Most important theme on my.
On your, yeah, absolutely. How old is she now?
9.
9. Okay. So Rabbi Zinkov, who has been recording this for us, has just popped a question in the chat saying, how radical can we be if a text is really difficult? Can we change Torah text to make them, or to make the text more inclusive, more egalitarian, to represent more people? Or do you feel that we need to stay with the text as it is and explore our response to it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there is a project underway right now changing the gender of the entire Torah. So that certainly challenges and opens up new possibilities within the text. For me, one of the openings that difficult texts create is that they mirror our world, right? So the violence against women in our texts is still found all over the world. The homophobia in our text is still a reality of our society. So I think that, and the texts have often contributed to the violence or the homophobia. So I don't think we can just change them. I think that we need to use them as mirrors that we hold up to ourselves and to our world, and ask, how do we go forward from this? I mean, Rebecca Alpert once said that every year when we read Leviticus 18, condemning male sex, we should declare that Pride weekend in the synagogue and have a panel of gay and lesbian people talking about the impact of the text and, what that means for the community and how we open up the community. So I think there are ways that we can be creative and transformative using what the text teaches us about ourselves and the world.
Yeah, that's that's where really we began, because I think the candor and frankness and courage of what you drew out in Standing Again at Sinai, as well as your midrashim and your ways of memory, in the particular essay I was looking at this morning, Weaving the Visions, all of it is a kind of bravery in looking at what's not there and what is there, but it really reinforces our being part of the community as we grapple with it. So that question from Igor really helps us to think maybe actually we leave it in its awful, awkward difficulty and we respond to it. Judith, you have brought so much to us. I'm slightly thankful for you that you are not in person. I know the last time you were in London was for Rabbi Chaim Kassas's ordination, and he now has this extraordinary community in Spain where he does great creative things. I think you might be mobbed and might have to, flee for your safety with the questions that I think we will have for you. But I think what you've done, which we as a liberal community, we surprise ourselves by being connected to tradition, to Torah, to our desire to pray, to understand our prayers, to study Torah. And indeed, for the night of Shavuot, we are going to be studying all night before we wake up in the morning to read the book of Ruth. And I think you've just reminded us that actually this is good work that we are doing, both spiritually and intellectually, to hold our legacy and to hold it to account, but to do so creatively and with enthusiasm and alacrity, really, to run to it. You have been incredibly generous by the questions that I came up for you and the expansion of those questions and answering Igor's and Rabbi Yuval Keren's. Thank you so much, Judith, and we wish you a Hag Sameach, a Hag Shavuot Sameach, and thank you so much.
Thank you, and Hag Sameach to all.